Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable, and the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why the Australia Institute is publishing our first book as part of our 30th anniversary celebrations. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia from leading thinkers such as Yanis Varoufakis, Auntie Pat Anderson, and Professor Peter Doherty. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to pre-order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Welcome to After America. I'm Dr Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. Well, we're learning more every day about what the second Trump administration might look like and who the rest of the world will be dealing with. Trump's pick for Attorney General is now Pam Bondi, a more competent and experienced version of Matt Gaetz.
The Department of Justice, the prosecutors will be prosecuted, the bad ones. The investigators will be investigated because the deep state, last term for President Trump, they were hiding in the shadows, but now they have a spotlight on them.
He's picked Kristi Noem to run the Department of Homeland Security, putting another MAGA loyalist in charge of things like domestic terrorism prevention.
Just to put it to bed once and for all, did you or did you not meet with Kim Jong-un?
I am not going to talk about this.
Wouldn't it be why is that such a difficult one to say publicly?
Because I've taken that line out of the book and I'm not going to discuss it.
Okay, but I guess the question is because you wrote it in the book, people just wanted to know whether that was an accurate or inaccurate.
He's picked China hawk John Ratcliffe to run the CIA.
It is an economic war. I take it one step further. I have said that, China is in a cold war with us. The problem is we're not in one with China in return as we should be.
And will likely tap Kash Patel for the FBI.
Now, Patel has promoted conspiracy theories about a so-called deep state. He's even embraced QAnon. In December of 2023, he told Steve Bannon's podcast this about Trump's political foes, saying, quote, "We will go out and find the conspirators, not just in government, but in the media. And, quote, we're going to come after you, whether it's criminally or civilly."
All of this, of course, has big implications for those of us outside the United States too. During the first Trump administration, those running the CIA and the Department of Justice sought to prosecute an Australian citizen, Julian Assange, for publishing the truth. Advocates for press freedom warn that Assange's eventual prosecution now serves as a dangerous precedent. And the Trump administration is likely to use that to pursue journalists and whistleblowers, even outside the United States. Trump has already told us as much.
We will launch a major crackdown on government leakers who collude with the fake news to deliberately weave false narratives and to subvert our government and our democracy. When possible, we will press criminal charges.
To look at what this might mean and how Australia might navigate this rocky future, we're joined this week by Zoe Daniel. Zoe is the independent member for Goldstein. Before being elected to Parliament in 2022, Zoe spent 30 years as a journalist, much of that as a foreign affairs specialist. She covered the US elections in 2016, and in 2021, Zoe co-wrote the book Greetings from Trumpland, How an Unprecedented Presidency Changed Everything, with Roscoe Whalen. I spoke to Zoe in her office in Parliament House in the last sitting week of the year, so you might hear some division bells in the background every now and then. Here's Zoe now. Zoe, thank you so much for joining us on After America.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's lovely to have you. Zoe, you probably know more about the United States and Donald Trump in particular than anybody maybe in the Parliament. Were you at all surprised by the result of the US elections?
I was not surprised, no. I probably, like most people, did wonder whether Kamala Harris had it in her in that very short time frame because she had some very rapid momentum after she took over from Biden and a lot of money came in for her, but it seemed to me that she'd flattened out towards the end. And prior to that, I had absolutely no doubt that Trump was going to win. So no surprise.
Yeah. What made you so sure that Trump was going to win?
Well, I think firstly the dynamic with Biden, obviously, and the doubts over Biden's ability to continue lent themselves to Trump's sort of positioning of himself as a strong man. So the distinction between them was so clear. I think, look, I covered the election of Donald Trump in 2016. I subsequently wrote a book with a colleague of mine, and he actually texted me on the day of the election saying we wrote a very prescient book after the result was clear, because the end of the book said he'll be back, basically.
Yeah.
He's not someone who's going to give up easily. He has incredible self-belief and still, as has been evidenced by the election result, a lot of support. And I think probably the most interesting aspect of the result for me was that he was able to win the popular vote and he actually strengthened his base compared to the election that I'd previously covered in Trump Mark 1.
Yeah, which is something to grapple with. As you say, he's back, and he's back with a vengeance. And it seems like the guardrails aren't as strong this time. And, he's wasted no time in appointing a number of, or nominating, I suppose, a number of loyalists for his new cabinet. What do you make of how the cabinet is shaping up, and how different do you think a second Trump administration might be from the first?
Well, I think what's notable about it is that my observations of the first administration was that there was, some level of attempt to employ people in significant roles who had expertise in those areas. And you may or may not agree with the political background or the views of some of the generals, for example, like James Mattis or McMaster and others who were involved in the first administration. But, these were people who knew their stuff. Many of them were people who had already well-developed international relationships. So in the defence and national security space, for example, people that Australia and others in the Five Eyes had dealt with. This time, it seems that there's been, maybe they feel that they have a mandate, or Trump feels that he has a mandate to just put in whoever he wants. So that sort of adherence to what you might describe as the norms of the way that you might do things has sort of evaporated. And I guess, I always say that the only thing that's predictable about Trump is his unpredictability. But the thing is, now you have a lot of people around him where that also applies. And so I think that just makes it kind of interesting and complex to try to crystal ball gaze about what might happen.
Yeah, it is, of course, very complex. And there's been, unsurprisingly, a lot of angst in Australia about how, we're going to manage that relationship with Trump, much of which focuses on Trump himself, how we might manage that individual and his unpredictability. But as you say, that's broadened a lot now to include these cabinet picks as well. How do you think Australia and the Australian government are going to be able to deal with this administration?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I think that one thing that I would say is that foreign governments obviously learnt things during the first Trump administration. As a journalist who was covering the White House at the time, my observation was that the usual pathways basically disappeared, and you had to find different ways of doing things. In a sort of traditional media environment, for example, you'd have your contacts that you work to get information. There would be official pathways to get official statements. When the president was doing something, there'd be sort of prior notification of how the day or the week might evolve. That certainly didn't happen after the 2016 election. And so everyone, journalists, diplomats, governments, had to kind of find backdoor ways into having conversations with the administration. And you saw, for example, Joe Hockey, who was the Australian ambassador at the time, his way was to play golf with Trump and try and talk to Trump on the golf course, because in many ways the only way of dealing with the Trump administration is to deal with Trump himself. So there's been some learning through that time, and governments like ours will have to try to apply that as people are appointed into the pivotal roles. But also, I think a country like Australia will inevitably lean on our historical relationship with the US, the importance of that, the economic trade balance, the fact that, they need us, we need them. Trump is quite transactional and to some degree pragmatic. And so I think, they're the kinds of things that our government will have to navigate. I think that the other thing about Trump is, well, this sort of goes without saying that he's such an interesting personality. And obviously I've spent a lot of time thinking about this during my life. But how do you deal with Donald Trump as a person? Because I think he's actually quite a good reader of people. And if you're not genuine in your interaction with him, he's going to know that straight away. And so sucking up to Trump's not going to work. But then being kind of really bolshy with him's probably not going to work either. But he respects strength. And so how do you find a pathway through that to actually achieve Australia's needs?
I'm interested in what you think Australia's needs are in that relationship now. You mentioned the historic relationship, much of which is based on this idea that we need the United States for our security. And there is, I think, some justifiable concern in the Australian community about tying our security to a Trump administration. Do you think that there is space within the relationship, and especially with the relationship with the Trump administration, for some, I guess, measure of independence, or the Australian government standing up in a different way for Australia's interests? Given that Trump has done things like threaten to use the military against his own people or mass deportations, there are going to be some pretty serious questions about Australian interests and Australian values here. Is there space to do that kind of standing up, do you think?
Maybe it depends who's doing the standing up and who's in government. And obviously we've got an election coming. I think that it is really important that we assert our independent thinking. And we're not. I think we do need the relationship with America to varying degrees, and I have some concerns about AUKUS for various reasons. Apart from anything else, I don't think that we've had a national conversation about it that we need to have, and that critics of it have in effect been shut down. But beyond that, we're a Western country in Asia, and the deep engagement that we need to grow with our Asian neighbours, and by that I mean Southeast Asia and to some degree China, but also the Asia Pacific is very different to the US dynamic. And for a long time we managed to sort of straddle the US-China relationship and our relationship with both of them without having to make a choice. Now, obviously, China has changed a lot over that time, but so has the US. So we do, I think, we need to assert our own values within this. And, in some ways it reminds me of it's much smaller scale, obviously, but my engagement with the different players here in this building. We find common ground where there is common ground. Where there isn't, we step back and go down another pathway. And I think that, that's the way that we need to be thinking about it, but it will be quite delicate, inevitably.
The AUKUS submarine pact could be at risk under a Donald Trump presidency. Admiral Mike Rogers says he believes the president will question how the US benefits under the deal.
Many people are worried about Australia being dragged into one of Trump's wars. Is the military relationship with the United States something that your government is reconsidering or rethinking?
No.
Yeah, I think you're right. You mentioned AUKUS, and I can't resist following up about it. What are your concerns about that deal, and does Trump amplify those concerns for you?
Yeah, I mean, I've stated my concerns about it publicly before, and I think these concerns are quite common in the public arena, certainly from constituents who often actually raise AUKUS with me.
Really?
and it's just to do with, really, at its core, how closely should we be tying ourselves to the Americans, and do we put ourselves in a situation where if they do something, we have to do it too? And particularly with the additional volatility of a Trump administration, or indeed any administration down the track where we feel like we don't have enough common ground. And, you know, where's the line? I think that's sort of the core of a lot of my constituents' concerns. There's I think there's an underlying anxiety in communities now because of what's going on around the world about sort of inexorably moving towards a larger global conflict. And I think people want to see like really considered decision making, that as you step things through and you make a decision that you're sort of creating building blocks to that unwittingly. And, you know, again, at what point in that decision-making process do you go, no, actually, this is a bridge too far? There's obviously, you know, the enormous financial investment as it relates to AUKUS. There's, you know, a whole lot of question marks in my mind about the technology and whether it's actually needed or appropriate, whether it will be redundant by the time it actually is in place, the timeframes. I mean, there's lots of things. And then again, just that sort of underlying issue that I don't think because it's bipartisan policy, a national conversation about it's been kind of disallowed. And I don't think that's great.
You mentioned earlier on your constituents and how they're raising concerns about AUKUS. Foreign policy is traditionally, I suppose, an area where that feels further out of reach for democratic accountability, you know, often because of a pretty locked-in bipartisan consensus around the alliance in particular. How important do you think independent members of parliament are when it comes to discussions about foreign policy in Australia?
Look, I think it's really important in every policy area to have different voices in the room. I think particularly actually defence and arguably national security, that it's important to have different perspectives in the room. I mean, clearly those areas need to be taken really seriously, and often there's some really nuanced elements of them, and that needs to be treated really carefully. But I think that there's a little bit of an attitude, particularly from the coalition. I mean, they've been overt about this, where they think that that's ground for the major parties only. And I say, well, 30% of Australians didn't vote for you guys, and people in my electorate raise foreign policy issues with me, and I have a background in foreign affairs, and therefore I think can engage with those issues quite credibly, as can others in the House and the Senate. So I think that to enable the perspectives of all Australians to be included in those conversations, particularly in committees and in that policy-making framework, is quite important. And, you know, a good example of this is the debate over the Defence Committee earlier this year, where the government was keen to have a committee allocated specifically to defence, and I think that's really actually quite important with everything that's going on in that policy space. And in the end, it didn't get up because although the coalition also supports a defence committee, they didn't want anyone from the crossbench on it. Now, ostensibly, they didn't want anyone from the Greens on it, but they had also, in a previous iteration of a similar conversation, stated that they didn't want anyone from the crossbench on the PJCIS, the Intelligence Committee. I think that's pretty unreasonable. And particularly, as you've said, in the context that you have bipartisan policy on these issues, and there's a high risk of groupthink, where we really should be pulling apart these policy areas and putting them back together just to make sure that they serve the economy, our communities, our place in the world, and all those sorts of things. And certainly as an independent, I don't seek to obstruct. You know, I see my role as questioning, but also being collaborative and making better policy and improving policy with the government of the day, and also engaging with the opposition to enable, you know, a broad range of Australian perspectives and checks and balances to be inserted into policy making. And surely that is no more critical than in the area of defence policy, which costs a fortune, but also holds Australian lives at its core, and also the lives of other people around the world if we're to engage in theatres of war. So, you know, I feel quite strongly about that, actually. And, you know, as part of that, I've engaged quite deeply with the Defence Minister and the various heads of defence during this parliamentary term with my crossbench colleagues. And I think that's been incredibly useful to all of us, to the government and to the members of the crossbench, because it just enables a conversation about these issues that government would otherwise not have.
And hopefully as well, you know, encourages further transparency in these policy areas. And that's one of the areas where independents like yourself have had a really big influence, I think, especially on issues like whistleblowing and Julian Assange as well, which is, I guess, an issue that has really disrupted that bipartisan consensus in pretty interesting ways and often really effective ways. We've just seen in the US Congress another bipartisan letter to President Biden encouraging him to pardon Julian Assange. So I just wanted to ask you, I suppose as a final question, what you make of that and how hopeful you are for a pardon, you know, to encourage that kind of transparency we were talking about.
Yeah, so I did briefly see Stella Assange and also Julian's brother, Gabriel, a couple of days ago, and we talked briefly about that. I mean, it is something that I would support. Whether it's something that the government will do anything about, I think, is an open question. They may feel like, well, we've done enough, job done. But, you know, look, I can understand why the family's pushing that. I do think that you're right, though, sort of on the broader issue of Julian and whistleblowers and such, having a more multi-partisan approach to it, and with independents in the mix, but also, you know, National Party members, Liberals, Labor, it sort of it breaks down the barriers to being open about what you actually think when people are speaking from a variety of positions. The beauty of being an independent is that you're not hamstrung by the party position, and you can be much more direct on these kinds of things, humanitarian issues, ethical issues, and such. And I think that on issues like Julian and the plight of various whistleblowers, it's good to have a number of voices in that conversation who can be honest and open from a human perspective and an ethical perspective about what is actually happening, rather than being beholden to the rigidity of a party position. And some issues, you know, situations that involve actual people and real consequences warrant the ability to open up that conversation so that we can all just be a little bit more, you know, direct with the Australian public about our thinking.
Which I think the Australian public is crying out for, and we're really grateful for your voice. So thank you so much for your time, Zoe.
Thanks so much for having me.
This episode was recorded on Thursday the 28th of November. No doubt a bunch of stuff will have happened since then. You will have heard at the start of this episode that the Australia Institute is publishing our first book as part of our 30th anniversary celebrations. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia from leading thinkers like economist and author Yanis Varoufakis, human rights lawyer Jennifer Robertson, and former president of Kiribati, Anote Tong. There's also one from me on the future of Australia's relationship with the United States. You can pre-order it now via our website, australiainstitute.org.au. If you're enjoying After America, please help us spread the word by telling your friends about the show. You can find us on social media. We are at the Oz Institute, that's with an AUS, on Twitter and Instagram, and at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky. And you can reach out to us with feedback and episode ideas via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. We'll be back next Tuesday. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.